Next speaker is Raimundas Vidunas from Vilnius University, talking about complexity through anticipation. And yes, so you can share your screen and go to full screen. Okay, good. Thanks very much. Oops.
Okay, sorry, I forgot to put my microphone on. Okay. So
but now you're not sharing, so we can see you,
okay,
but not your slides.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm sharing. Can you hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you and we can see your slides. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the title of my talk became more specific, so to highlight clearly the complete incongruence of my subject to the topic of this symposium. So I will talk about completely different world. Foremost, I would like to thank organizers for the enthusiastic invitation to give specifically this non-mathematical talk here. I think there is only one good excuse for this presentation is that I already gave a similar talk on philosophy of complexity 4 years ago at the similar meeting in Nankai. Symposium. The title of my talk then was Delegated Causality of Complex Systems. At that time, I mentioned Gödel's theorem at least. Today, I will not mention any mathematics whatsoever, for I'm still a mathematician officially. So today I talk about anticipation. So anticipation and delegated causality mean more or less the same thing, indeed. And I have 2 published articles if you will be interested later. So my topic is really ambitious. So explanation of the complex phenomena such as living organisms, mindful thinking, and all kinds of biological or social complexity. And although science has made big progress in analyzing these complexities, they still look puzzling or counterintuitive to laymen and scientists themselves. As the behavior of these phenomena still confound the reductionist principles of science, particularly of fundamental physics. So, for example, biologists talk jokingly about the Harvard law of animal behavior. Under carefully controlled experimental conditions, an organism will behave as it pleases. So this is a direct contrast to the deductive logic of laws, axioms, and initial conditions. So it's quite a tease to a rationalist audience, I think. After all, we live in a physical world where causality is supposed to reduce to fundamentally elementary physical interactions, and the thermodynamics prescribes dissipation towards chaotic equilibria, and evolutionary biology and economics declare the primacy of self-interest. But we still have those remarkable observations of agency, intention, cooperation, altruism, free choice, and complex behavior. And since I am going to say something, some kind of explanation of the complex phenomena, I should come up with some new idea or framework. So my new hammer to pound on all the nails of complexity confusion is called anticipation. So before I will explain what I mean by anticipation, let me know that anticipation is already a buzzword in scientific community already. It started with theoretical biologist Robert Rosen who try to formalize biological systems using the notion of anticipatory systems and even category theory as we know it in mathematics. And in the last 5 years, the literature on anticipation is just exploding, particularly in the context of social complexity and policy making. So there is a whole UNESCO project on anticipation studies and so-called future literacy. So what are the people saying? By the way, you see this quite complicated. Okay, maybe I will try to reduce my window. So here are a couple of quotes about anticipation. The major surprise embedded in the theory of anticipation is that it is a widespread phenomenon present in and characterizing all types of realities. Life in all its varieties is anticipatory. The brain works in anticipatory way. The mind is obviously anticipatory. Society and the structures are anticipatory. Even non-living and non-biological systems can be anticipatory. And then there is a quote from a paper on artificial intelligence. It says that anticipation is an emerging concept that can provide a bridge between both the deepest philosophical theories about the nature of life and cognitions and empirical, biological, and cognitive sciences steeped in reductionist conceptions of causality. So it's a promising perspective on complexity. So how how this anticipation is defined in current academic literature. So first of all, Robert Rosen's definition of an anticipatory system is a natural system that contains an internal predictive model of itself and of its environment that allows it to change state at an instant in accord with the model's prediction pertaining to a later instant. So here the key is that the adequate representation of the self and the environment. So this supposes significant cognitive abilities. And in the context of the UNESCO project led by Roberto Popoli, anticipation is seen as an advanced part of so-called future studies beyond forecast and foresight. So that's the part where expected things are being actively implemented and where the future is pulling us to act, so to speak. And I should also mention predictive processing. That's actually a dominant paradigm of cognition in neuroscience currently. The key idea is that the brain is a prediction or inference machine. That kind of idea was considered already by Helmholtz 150 years ago. So this paradigm supposes that cognition is organized hierarchically with the perceptual data transmitted from senses from the bottom and model predictions, expected sense data traveling from the cortex from the top. And at each level, the prediction error is calculated and handled either by adjusting the upper models, reinterpreting the data, or some bodily action. That's called active inference. So that means your movement become like self-fulfilling prophecy. And this whole prediction process is optimized by minimizing the internal entropy, so-called free energy, following past experience and Bayes and inference. So this amounts to minimizing the long-term average of surprise for an organism. And this predictive model extends to all living organisms as they persist, resist decay by a multi-layered predictive model of the world, staying within a range of homeostatic states, thereby maximizing the statistical evidence of own existence. To me, this theory looks a lot like the theory of rational agency in economics. So everything is supposed to make those predictions very optimally by Bayes and inference, and that's where I am skeptical. As we know from the behavioral economics, the work of Daniel Kahneman, that people are not actually rational, so we should not expect more rationality or optimality from other organisms or more basic complex systems. So my view of anticipation does not boil down to prediction or representation of the world or some interaction with the future. That kind of causality of the future is problematic metaphysically. It's a kind of wilder concept. So the idea is that anticipation does not have to be based on past experience, on some statistics. You can anticipate for any reason at all, or for no viable reason. And anticipation basically boils down to a useful fiction. So thereby I will be touching on the American pragmatism. So I can claim that anticipators basically take a stance of pragmatic fictionalism, nicely described in William James' essay, The Will to Believe. So that includes all those self-referential stories and actions for the sake of purposeful action and fulfilling experiences. As an extreme example, I suggest the DNA molecule. It's basically, its genetic information constitutes the mythology of a potential life for the organism. Even if there are some critical mutation, the organism is supposed to live like those mutations are just perfect mutations for its own reproductive benefit. And the key for anticipation that some favorable input of the environment is anticipated. To be alive means to anticipate livable conditions. So for example, not every acorn will turn into an oak tree. So you need some luck, epistemic luck or something like that. Now, since I am shifting the meaning of anticipation in academic literature, I will not hurry to set its definition in stone. So just as life has to go on often without firm definitions, let's proceed with some fluidity or phenomenologically, so to speak. So first of all, so here are 4 key features for anticipation that I want to stress now. So first of all, anticipations have a passive character. So that means that something external in space or time has to meet your anticipation. Secondly, anticipations are fallible. So not all anticipations are fulfilled and not all anticipations are charming or acceptable in some sense. Related feature is that anticipation implies existential agenda. That means anticipators are more than just passive observers and predictors. They seek something more. And as I mentioned, deep down, anticipations are fictions. That would be the metaphysical status. So let's start with this passive character of anticipation. I talked about that 4 years ago, indeed, mostly. So a prototypical primitive example would be this row of dominoes. Of course, it's standing, but if any perturbation occurs, then a lot of action might follow. So that's the image I want to keep when I'm talking about anticipation. So anticipation is a kind of dual concept to intervention. We complain about interventions, but we also often anticipate them. And as a the dynamical system, an anticipator is specifically sensitive to perturbation. So I'm focusing on this kind of features. So another way I can say that anticipator is radically open to some interventions and to some novel semantic roles. That means the whole essence of anticipator is awaiting some intervention and acting upon it. An example in an economic setting is the demand or customer side of the commercial supply-demand interaction. So as economic actors, we all have some wishes or demands, but someone has to, or something has to satisfy those demands. And as I talked 4 years ago, I talked then about cost delegation. So that's more or less, I call it now anticipation. And this anticipated causality resolves the riddle of the direction of causality, because from the physical perspective, all causality comes from fundamental elements, but we also have some evident top-down causations, and they can be explained in the way that those fundamental elements are organized in anticipatory way. And then when intervention happens, the anticipated effects are better correlated with interventions, hence the empirical analysis assigns causality to those interventions. So we got some appearance of top-down control. And on the basic material level, this organization of those elementary particles should be in some scale-free, should be organized as some scale-free dynamical system, or some dynamical system on the edge of chaos. So that that kind of system would be maximally open to interventions or some external influence. So for example, there is a lot of research on brain connectome. Connectome means just all the structural connectivity, the physical wiring of the brain, this graph structure, so to speak, how the neurons are connected. And a lot of research says that this organization is organized as some in some critical state. And my argument is that this kind of critical state is necessary for brain to be radically open for some external processing of information beyond its physical essence. And 4 years ago, I accordingly defined the most primitive anticipators as primed dynamical systems. So it's just dynamical systems that can exhibit complex potentially utilitarian behavior depending on moderate adjustment of boundary conditions. So most complexity scientists make a sharp distinction between perception, reaction dynamics, and more complicated behavior. So I see this anticipatory behavior more on a spectrum starting from these reactionary primed systems. And that causal relation that we obtain between a primed dynamical system and some external or emergent influence, I call delegated causality. So the bottom line is that anticipator is structurally primed to perform some action under certain influences, and thereby it basically embodies intentionality in its structure to behave in that way. So if it is organized for some particular action, so then we can start talking about intention to perform that action. And Terence Deacon has the term intentionality for this kind of structural readiness. So as an example of a primed dynamical system, I suggest a neuron. Okay, it reacts in a particular way, fires a signal under specific conditions, under specific signals from other neurons, right? Conversely, an anticipator can be viewed as a generalization of a neuron. And we can even imagine, if you like, that anticipators may organize themselves into a global brain. So for example, think about fertile soil, where there are many microorganisms interacting. And it gives its fertility in some way. The interesting thing about neurons is that the default state has a non-zero resting potential across the axon membrane. So that means that this equilibrium has to be maintained metabolically. So it's costly, but it is, I would say, necessary for the quick and effective physiological function of the neuron. Okay, if this charge of neuron axon would be zero, then to give it some energetic impulse would be very costly. It's kind of necessary for that neuron to be charged, and in that way it can react very quickly. And I would say that similarly, other anticipators would have to be invested in the intentional states. So they would not be just some passive mechanical structures, but they are on some kind of higher, they would be already in some higher energetic level so that they would release that energy on demand. So anticipators put their money where they are on what they are anticipating. Now I come to the second feature. Anticipations are fallible. So first of all, they might be ineffective or even detrimental in the long run, but also they could be a very blunt tool of comparable to superstition, prejudice, stereotypical categorization, tribalism, and other biases that people enjoy or criticize. So one mundane example of foundering anticipation is chronic stress response in our modern world. So there is this book by Robert Sapolsky. It's about stress in biology and in human life. So the argument is that we indeed have that stress response because that is necessary to survive in the world. But naturally, this response occurs sporadically. But in the modern life, it is triggered almost constantly and causes health problems to us. Now, I will also remind that the famous work of behavioral economist Kahneman and Tversky, they basically established that human judgment is not rational, but can be patently biased or fallible. And as I already mentioned, more primitive forms of anticipation should be expected to be even more superficial or crude. Now, I have here a useful distinction for identifying those suboptimal anticipations. So on one hand, some anticipations in an organism are indeed highly reliable and impressively optimized. So there are many examples of that. And surely predictive processing or neural network computations can efficiently organize statistically frequent experiences, but organisms have to learn and act also in uncertain environments, in the environments of low validity for learning in the terminology of Kahneman. That is when organisms have to rely on contingent cues, situational priming or framing, and what we call cognitive biases. Maybe for humans that is not always necessary, but we are inclined to act in that biased way, just because we are kind of biologically used to act quickly. And this less specified, less defined cognition requires more like interpretative or associative character. So we grab on whatever clues we came up with, and at least we have one one point to orient ourselves, that's the so-called existential agenda of our organism. And that brings me to the third point, that anticipation implies existential agenda. So first, I would come back to this setting of predictive processing. And my opposition to that anticipatory cognition is more than just the game of predicting the sensorium, as it is described in the theory of predictive processing. So beyond that, living or cognizing beings seek to realize their destined actions in the world, even if those actions have no precedent in the life, or they're not statistically viable. And that contrast, that difference between just passive observation and prediction and action is well captured by the infamous Marx's thesis, who said that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So that's what really living anticipators do. And I defined accordingly the existential agenda as a set of anticipatory visual plots, or even you can call them myths, of cognizing being what could happen in the world, in the life, or what should happen, together with the semantic meaning to its existence. So for example, if we can think of sexual mating as a kind of less defined, less specified element of life, which happens kind of more messily. Or other example I can suggest is imagine you meet a stray cat, and it will probably have some behavioral strategies to compel you to improve its own life quality, right? Biological life itself can be defined as an existential agenda that includes metabolism, self-repair, and reproduction. So that's the minimal existential agenda for life, right? And this whole spectrum of possible existential agendas could be viewed as an extrapolation of Maslow's pyramid of needs. So as you know, human aspirations depend on the level of resources they enjoy. Okay, so still talking about this existential agenda and changing the world. If you don't like Marx, I will offer this ironic contrast that the prototypical examples of consequential change happen to be capitalists like John D. Rockefeller. So I read his biography recently. So he was quite optimistic about this early oil industry, even if there were a lot of uncertainties about it in those 1860s. And also I can quote the famous pacifist philosopher Bertrand Russell, which he said in a book that every living thing is a sort of imperialist seeking to transform as much as possible of its environment into itself and its seeds, and so on. Okay, and the last point, as I already talked, that anticipations deep down are just fictions. So anticipations are heuristic fictions rather than rigid representations of the environment or the future. Anticipated triggers may never happen, and but anyway, life presumes this livable environment, presence of nourishing ingredients, and so on.
You have 5 minutes of regular time left.
5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Ah, right. Yes, indeed. Okay. So structurally, anticipators are ready to function, so they effectively take a fictionalist stance where the distant event or behavior is not guaranteed truth, but a useful fiction, and thereby world's unpredictability is humbly acknowledged. So I already mentioned that American pragmatism could be of some guidance here. including William James's functionalist psychology and the will to believe. And even if Western philosophy has generally a distaste for speculative metaphysical narratives, I would argue that was a necessary step in the early evolution of complexity, a reversal of Comte's. So the positivist philosopher Comte formulated some progression of knowledge from theological to metaphysical to modern positive forms of knowledge. But if we're interested in primitive cognitive systems, we might think of reversing. We might look at this progression in reverse. Okay. So to put this impulse for believing fiction, so to speak, in your life in perspective, I will, to underscore this shameless fictionalism, so to speak, let me refer to speculative realists. So that's a kind of philosophy, a modern kind of philosophy. They talk about wildness of being or feral things, meaning that the objects in the world are much richer in themselves than we can ever perceive with our limited perception. But I will invert the focus here. That this kind of wild epistemology, that means feral anticipation or feral categorization, is that's what causes those interesting complex things to happen. There are, of course, similar natural philosophies. For example, we can look at Santayana's animal faith, Feihinger's philosophy of as if, and also Nietzsche's distinction between Dionysian and Apollonian thinking. Apollonian is the rationalist living or thinking, and Dionysian living is more wild and life-affirming. And from the semiotics perspective, of course, all those fictions constitute organisms Umwelt, that means some self-interested semiotic worldview of an organism. So that means anything that he perceives it's some affordance, it's useful for something. You see a tree, yeah, and you already imagined what that means for you. Also, these life fictions have a character of Kant's synthetic a priori, and the whole worldview of an organism could be related to Kant's transcendental unity of perceptions. So that means a synthetic a priori is kind of looks like contradiction in terms, but as we know, Kant started this kind of direction towards postmodernism by stating that we have some categorical structures in our mind that organize the world. Structures like space, perception of space and time. Anyway, so here you see what they call a midway recap, but I guess, well, it's more than a midway recap of my slides, but I guess I can stop around here soon. So I will recap that anticipation is kind of inherently passive, right? So it means it presupposes some external contribution or intervention. Anticipations are fallible. They are prone to failure or detrimental effects on environmental social factors. And compared to predictive processing, anticipation is more than mere observation and prediction. It's kind of it encompasses fulfillment of some existential agenda, and that existential agenda may be challenging rather than viable. And general anticipation has a character of useful fiction, or more primitively categorization of meaning designation. So has a character of useful fiction for self-benefiting action. And how to define that fiction more primitively, well, then I suggest to start from categorization or some semiotic meaning designation. And in some, anticipation is, I advertise anticipation as one weird trick of nature that engenders life. Okay, so whether I'm finished or not, maybe it's a good place for questions.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Are there any questions? Any questions out there?
Oh, okay, so
Oh.
I baffled you with anticipation, right?
About it.
Okay, I can.
Andre, you
Okay.
have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So you mentioned that anticipation as a useful fiction directed towards living conditions, right? Towards getting a system towards living conditions. Can you make a parallel with machine learning? So in machine learning, there is a bias which people seem to observe. So which is directed towards data that appears in nature somehow. So if you take a neural network, somehow the way that people usually initialize a neural network is biased towards producing functions that are very well suited to mimic data from the natural world. Is there a parallel between this and what?
Okay, my opinion is that machine learning is more like predictive processing. There is quite a direct relation between them. There, of course, in predictive processing, you also have priors. That means prior assumptions, and you develop your knowledge or model of the world by Bayes and inference. So which each new data you adjust it by Bayesian rules. Well, in machine learning is something very similar happening. So that's why I think the machine learning is limited in this sense, because it's still not in the real world. It's just observing, as it stands now. It's just observing and predicting, but it's not acting. It's still for up to humans to act, right? So I don't see machine learning as development of artificial intelligence in this anticipatory state yet. It's pretty that directly follows that paradigm of predictive processing.
Yes,
Okay.
there are various flavors that are artificial intelligence and machine learning, and some of them, there is a notion of action and there is a notion of learning how to act. So there are these forms of reinforcement learning where
yes, anticipation is basically focused on how to act. So basically brain works as some kind of cloud computing service for the body how to act. Okay, so maybe I can finish with some kind of surface talk that anticipation is everywhere. So for example, we can take Olympic Games on any other global event. So of course, no one could have anticipated that the Tokyo Olympics would be postponed so long. And of course, the organization itself is a massive anticipatory enterprise, and especially under the new normal conditions. And many sports involve anticipatory games. So here I list some elements of the real world which can be interpreted as anticipation. For example, trust, confidence, faith. Okay, and a couple of speculations for physics, so to speak. You can check that slide later. And here are some biological examples of how anticipation happens in biology. So, for example, this phenomenological cycle of spring revival for me is an interesting example, how nature revives itself after the winter hibernation. Initial construction by beavers or earthworms is another interesting example. And viruses, for example, also we can discuss whether they are alive or not, but we can say that they are anticipator of some host population and their metabolic resources. And even if we think that we humans are more just completely independent of anything else, well, in our digestion is very dependent on the multitude of diverse microbial symbiotes and so on. So, from this anticipatory view, as an organism is quite passive, so it's more like a configuration of biochemical dominoes that seeks to position itself in the way of energy flows. But of course, it's very aggressively, fairly self-interested, right? So there is this, I try to formulate here some kind of hierarchical organization of anticipation. Okay, so I have 2 minutes. In complexity theory, it is often affirmed that complexity emerges often without any leadership. So my retort to this is, yes, there is no leading, but there is much following, okay? So we know, of course, from chaos and similar theories that following some rules can lead to complicated behavior, but eventually we want to, the question is then, why do those rules are followed, right? So here we see example of marmination by birds. So they follow apparently some rules. And here I kind of try to reverse this relation between brain and body. Usual view is that the brain commands the body, but on the other hand, brain weighs just like a few percent of the mass, but it consumes like 20% of energy. So it does not grab that energy from the body, it receives it from the body. The body delegates this energy to the brain, but of course it wants something, some guidance in return, okay? So then inside the brain, I kind of refer to this triune model of the brain. It's kind of discredited, but it's okay. But it kind of makes a new sense inside of this anticipatory perspective. And similarly, we can talk about the system one, about this fast impulsive system one, as described by Daniel Kahneman and others. Confronted with the rational but slow lazy system two. Fast decisions against the reasoned decisions. And my point here is that the system two is again, is not in charge really. It is again some kind of oracle for system one. When system one needs system two, it asks something. Otherwise, system two is silent without any motivation from system one. So that would be my point. So so this kind of consideration could be interesting for the context of machine learning. So I still see this. So indeed, this focus on action, what the body has to do.
I'm sorry, the time is now really up.
Yes.
I think we have to
so
move on.
I'm just finishing.
So
yeah,
if you could just finish
so
up.
that's my last point, that the whole point of anticipation is to tell the body what to do, roughly speaking. And I think that machine learning is still on the way towards that. Thank you for the attention.
Thanks very much.